Okay, well thanks everyone. I think I know a lot of people in the room, but if you don't, my name's Aaron, and I'll be talking today about Project 25, as Damien said, and it's got a bit of a longer-winded official title than you see on the slide there, but basically it revolves around cane farmers monitoring water quality and giving them some confidence in using water quality information to hopefully adjust or modify management practices. Now, probably before I launch into too much detail of the specifics about Project... Yeah, sorry, I didn't realise it hadn't been enlarged. Thinking about it? Okay, I can't see anything now, anyway.
It takes a few seconds.
Just takes a few seconds.
Oh, there we go. Okay, before I launch too much into the specifics of Project 25, we're all here as part of the Tropical Water Quality Hub. We all know what a big challenge dealing with diffuse pollution is from agricultural land uses, but it's probably worth taking a step back and having a touching base with some of the, I guess, the global context of often farmer and landholder attitudes towards water quality pollution and a lot of our attempted policy responses to sort of improve it. And if we look at a global level, we'll find that it's quite common that farmers or landholders express a lot of scepticism that water quality pollution problems even exist. There's often a lack of appreciation or acceptance of, or appreciation of the role that agriculture can play in catchment water quality pollution. There's often a lack of credibility associated with data collected by external agencies like government monitoring teams or scientists like a lot of us here in the room. And there's often a frequent criticism of a lack of data that's sort of at an appropriate spatial and temporal scale, that it's of actual use to the farmers, the people on the ground, on the coalface, that we really want to sort of help change management practices. And it doesn't matter if it's a farmer in the continental United States or Europe or the Great Barrier Reef catchment, you'll often find those sort of sentiments expressed through large proportions of a lot of those industries. If we look at some of the success stories when we come to water quality monitoring and engagement and extension that produces actual meaningful practice change, we'll find there's a lot of common threads there in industries. The willingness to actually adopt new practices, particularly in a meaningful way, is often directly related to how serious the actual farmer or landholder perceives that particular water quality pollution problem. So perhaps not surprisingly, a lot of pollutants like soil erosion, soil turbidity and things like that, they're very visual, obvious problems at a farm scale and a local catchment scale, and we often see soil conservation measures uptaken in a much more sort of meaningful, long-term way than we do some of the more invisible forms of pollution that we're trying to grapple with, like nutrient enrichment and pesticides. And you'll often hear an adage out in the Great Barrier Reef catchments talking to cane growers about, prove to me it's my molecule of nitrogen that you're finding, you know, out there at the end of the catchment or out in the marine environment. So with that sort of, I guess, cultural, societal attitudes in the background here when we're dealing with primary industries, probably worth bearing that in mind as I talk about Project 25. And Damien's already touched upon the title of the project in some ways, but it's probably worth touching upon some of the history and the background behind the birth of Project 25. The Tropical Water Quality Hub was launched a couple of years ago now or more up in Cairns with great ceremony, and 24 successful initial projects were announced at the launch by the then Environment Minister. And as part of the audience, there are a number of the really key influential cane growers from the Russell-Mulgrave catchment up near Cairns, and they must have taken the Environment Minister aside at the time and gave him their opinion of the state of the current state of GBR water quality science from the cane industry perspective. And they highlighted a number of points that were probably in common that we saw with those global examples that I gave. So a real lack of local water quality information from the Russell-Mulgrave catchment. They really want to know what the real cane industry specific contributions were to the pollutant loads that we see at the end of that catchment or those catchments. They express some real, I guess, distrust of the reliability of modelling, which is such a big part, it really underpins a lot of our policy responses around Reef Plan, the catchment modelling program, and just that general disconnection from the information in the state of GBR water quality science. So they must have been sufficiently persuasive because Greg Hunt, the Environment Minister at the time, sort of off the cuff announced a 25th project, Project 25, that's how its name came to be, and it's dealing much more with locally relevant water quality monitoring. And I see it, water quality monitoring is an important part of the program, don't get me wrong, but in some ways it's secondary. It's more about science communication and how do we sort of present or target water quality monitoring in a way that's actually relevant or meaningful to industries. And it's probably worth highlighting that a number of those, all of those cane growers that are involved with the initial parts of Project 25, they're not sort of knuckle-dragging hillbillies. They're really influential cane growers that run quite big businesses, big farming enterprises, fairly astute businessmen. A lot of them are seen as real industry leaders from a lot of different perspectives, but particularly from the environment as well. And the fact that we've lost them somewhere along the way probably highlights that there's been some sort of flaws or failures in the way that we've typically presented water quality information back, at least at some level, to the sugarcane industry. So Project 25, it's a little bit different in some ways in terms of a water quality monitoring program. It's got a really big emphasis on sort of grower ownership. So the steering committee for the project's mainly composed of all of those local cane growers that I mentioned, and also cane industry support organisations like cane growers at local and state levels. And the growers themselves and the steering committee have a really big sort of say in project design in many ways. So where we monitor, what particular questions they want answered, that sort of thing. Most of it does revolve around that, quantifying the relative contribution of just sugarcane cultivation to that end of catchment water quality that we're trying to improve. So there's a bit of an image here of the Russell-Mulgrave catchment for people that may be unfamiliar with it. It's just immediately below Cairns, Mulgrave River in the north, Russell River in the south. We're now monitoring water quality at all of these sites with yellow pins as part of Project 25. Hopefully you can make out the different colours. And it's all being captured downstream by the Great Barrier Reef catchment loads monitoring team gauging stations at Deerol and East Russell there, which gives us a nice little sort of ground truthing or reality check on the data that we're collecting to make sure it all does sort of make sense. But we're monitoring water quality across a range of different land uses, so relatively pristine water quality coming out of a lot of the wet tropics, rainforest, World Heritage areas there, urban mixed land uses, and obviously focusing also a lot of attention on some of the really key intensive agricultural commodities in the Russell-Mulgrave catchment, particularly sugarcane obviously, and also bananas. The water quality program itself in terms of its methodology is a bit of a mixed bag in some ways, a bit of a combination of fairly old school techniques. So unfortunately it still revolves me running around in the wet season and poking crocodiles out of the way and collecting water samples by hand, maybe some automated ISCO samplers if I'm lucky at a couple of sites. But there's also an emphasis on some really cutting edge technologies. So nitrate sensing probes that you can see here, that the discrete samples that we collect by hand or with an ISCO, they've got to go back to a laboratory for analysis and maybe a turnaround time for that information of several months in many cases. These nitrate sensing probes, they can sort of give you instantaneous idea of nitrate concentrations in the river and creek system. And they're sort of seen, I guess, as in many ways as sort of the new wave or the forefront of catchment monitoring into the future. And you'll see the US Geological Survey is investing a lot of time and effort in this real-time sensing technology. You can jump onto their websites, they've got hundreds of sites already monitoring nitrate, for example, among other parameters in real time across the continental United States. Jump on the website and you can sort of look up what's happening with water quality at a local catchment scale at any one of those sites. But they're still operating at quite broad spatial scales, so catchment scales of hundreds if not thousands of square kilometres in many cases. As part of Project 25 we're going to be trying to really push the boundaries and do this at a much finer scale and see if we can give that sort of real-time information almost at a sort of potentially even a paddock or farm scale for cane growers. I'm not going to spend a lot of time or detail on the specifics of the results that we're getting at this moment in time. We do have some sort of data sharing and management confidentiality arrangements in place with the cane industry, but just highlight a couple of little anecdotes of some of the lessons that we've learned or exciting little learnings that we've got to this moment in time at least. The graph I've got up on the slide here, that's an example of some of our real-time monitoring data at one of our fairly intensively developed catchments in the Russell-Mulgrave area, a mixed banana cane cropping catchment over about a 10-month period. So this blue trace here is the stream height in this particular monitoring location. The red trace is our nitrate concentration in milligrams per litre. You can see here not much was happening at this particular site through most of the year. Really intense rainfall event in early January this year, 300, 400 millimetres of rainfall in a single night. And you can see everything that happened with regards to water quality happened just within a week period around that event, where we got some significant slugs of or pulses of nitrate moving through that system. We presented this information back to the cane industry a couple of months later at a big growers breakfast in Dabinda, over 100 cane growers, as well as all the other data that we're collecting. But then it was kind of interesting, about 2 weeks later we went and presented it at a much smaller scale, local catchment sort of shed meeting with a number of the major cane growers in that particular catchment that we were monitoring. And as soon as I put the graph up, before I even sort of stood up and said, put his hand up and said, "Oh, I saw you present that at the growers breakfast, Aaron. I think that was probably my nitrate." And a lot of people in the room probably thought it was his nitrate too, because they knew what was happening at a local level. And but you know, he made a bit of a comedic or humorous comment then about, you know, it's my nitrate, who do I go and see about getting it back? But you can probably go and see Tony Webster, I'd say. He's got a bit of a stash of nitrate and ammonia at the moment by all accounts. And we can laugh about that sort of thing, but it is a little good news story in some ways, where probably for the first time this grower does sort of start thinking about, oh well, maybe it is my molecule of nitrogen that we're actually seeing now out at the end of the catchment. So a bit of a small success story in what's going to be a really big long-term challenge for us to get on top of. Some of the other interesting little avenues that we've sort of gone down in terms of communicating this information that seem to have got a bit of traction include how we sort of, you know, deal with the issues surrounding catchment loads, which is a big part of obviously reef plan and reef plan targets. If you've been around the reef space in the last few years, you're probably already very, very familiar with the concept of end of catchment loads and the sort of background natural contributions to end of catchment loads, the anthropogenic fractions, which particular part the reef plan targets are actually focusing on. But for whatever reason, this seems to have caused quite a bit of confusion out in the industry at some levels, and you'll often hear comments about it all comes from rainforest, all of that sort of thing. But one of the benefits of the Russell-Mulgrave catchment, at least in many ways, is a lot of the upper catchment areas are actually in relatively pristine wet World Heritage rainforest, and we're collecting data at a number of these sites sort of immediately upstream of where the intensive agriculture comes. So we've got a good idea of sort of natural background water quality. We're monitoring at sites downstream onto the floodplain where we've got the intensive agriculture. We can present that data in a number of different ways, but one of the easiest and the ways that growers seem to relate well to when you show them this sort of information is not just as a catchment load, but because we've got that data in a number of different downstream portions of the catchment, you can sort of start tying it into, we're making approximations if we know what the natural background water quality is, what's sort of the natural background contribution, what's the anthropogenic fraction that we're seeing from intensive agriculture in the catchment, and start sort of highlighting the growers that it's just this little green section here is the one that we're trying to manage. And if you've got any idea of the sort of spatial scale of land uses and the area of intensive ag in that particular catchment, you can relate that to a din yield, which we did with this particular example, and you can see that for that particular site that we were monitoring, the din yield from intensive agriculture came to about 9 kilograms of dissolved inorganic nitrogen per hectare per year, which is a lot less scary a number than the total load that we saw there of around 40 tonnes, and that you're starting to talk a language in terms of kilograms of nitrogen per hectare that a cane grower can relate to in many ways. So we seem to get a lot of good response and positive responses from presenting data in that way, and that it seems to be a fairly understandable way of presenting things. In terms of our project progress to this point in time, getting towards, well, over a year of data now, and getting into the, I guess the second wet season almost seems to be underway, a bit of an early start to the wet season this year where we're still collecting information. But a lot of the emphasis on this point in time has really been developing those sort of credibility and trust frameworks, particularly with the grower steering committee in some ways, where there might be that, you know, initial, not scepticism, but you know, we're all a bit wary of each other at the start of these projects, but we really made sure that they had a meaningful role in the design of the project. We're answering a lot of the questions that they wanted answered, and it was really about getting some you know, runs on the board in the early stages of things and developing that sort of rapport and trust with the growers. Lots of communication effort at a number of different scales with the stakeholders at play here. Obviously working a lot and keeping very regular updates with the steering committee itself, but also a lot of engagement with the broader industry, at least at a local and maybe even state level. And I certainly can't claim credit for a lot of this. I've been supported in large part by groups like the RRC media team, but the cane industry itself has been really enthusiastic about this, and a number of the sort of media arms, publications like the Australian Cane Grower magazine are always after regular updates on the project, radio interviews, that sort of thing. And while we've kept it fairly big scale at the moment, now that we've got some actual data to talk about at local levels, the future of the project will be really sort of targeting much more locally relevant water quality to some of the catchment areas that we're monitoring, and trying to lever that into some sort of discussion and practice change. Just an example of a nice little output that came out in the Australian Cane Growers magazine. On the banks of a river system down in the Russell catchment, giving the local growers the good news they'll be monitoring, the water quality leaving their cane farms. And a nice picture of Matt Keeley in the background, who's also been very supportive of this approach to this moment in time. So in terms of the future of Project 25, it'll be business as usual with the water quality monitoring component that's obviously underpins the whole thing. We'll be adding more sampling sites and probably starting to monitor at finer and finer spatial scales, moving up into the catchments and maybe some of the hot spots that we think we're identifying. And as I said, much more targeted extension with sort of smaller grower groups and much more localised, locally tailored water quality monitoring. But there'll be some other things going on with the project in the background, issues about how we might sort of upscale, or the scalability and transferability of Project 25. Lots of other water quality monitoring programs on similar but often slightly different veins throughout the GBR catchment area, and what are some of the key learnings that we can sort of take from all of that water quality research that's gone before us. But a really increasing emphasis on how we really develop or tailor water quality monitoring programs that can be used from a meaningful practice change perspective from cane growers. And I think one of the really exciting additions to the project has been a recent collaboration that we've undertaken with CSIRO and the Digiscapes project or platform. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. I'm not a CSIRO employee, so I'm probably not the best authority to speak specifically about Digiscapes, but it's one of CSIRO's big 6 future science platforms. So they see this sort of this sort of approach as a real future, and it's going to be throwing quite a bit of R&D investment and effort into this sort of approach in the next few years, I imagine. But Digiscapes is really around digital agriculture in many ways, and using fairly cutting-edge sensing technologies to develop sort of decision support frameworks for primary industries, and making sure that we can help along the way of optimising their productivity and also sustainability into the future. Not surprisingly, with regards to that collaboration, it's going to be revolving around sugarcane and cropping nutrient uptake efficiency. Tony's already given a fairly interesting talk about that sort of thing at the moment. Obviously a real research strength of CSIRO, so it'll be good to have them on board. And just a very simple idea of, I think, the idealised model that we might see for Project 25 into the future, where we'll have a very heavily monitored catchment, lots of monitoring happening in real time here at a range of spatial scales, from end of catchment through to sub-catchment, farm, maybe even different treatment scales on a particular farm on an individual paddock. All of that information getting fed up into the data cloud, integrating it with other information from things like short-term weather forecasting, maybe even remote sensing of things like crop vigour, growth rates, things like that, and finding a way to sort of feed that back to the grower on the ground in some sort of usable, practical fashion. But it's a lot bigger than that as well. There's sort of the monitoring component of things, but there's a number of different themes that also deal with some of the underlying sociology, I guess, and things like user experiences. How do we sort of really develop these platforms in a way that we can sort of feed back information to growers in a way that they really can relate to, that they really can use. Things probably a bit outside my area of expertise, but quite an exciting addition to the project in many ways. Just some ideas on how we might sort of do that. But in terms of a quick project summary, I hope by the end of the project it's more than just a water quality monitoring program, and hopefully we'll have some real frameworks or guidelines on how we develop these more bottom-up, grassroots driven almost approaches to water quality monitoring, rather than the traditional way we've done things where it's all sort of top-down, done by external agencies. And we'll be really trying to address some of those water quality communication gaps that I highlighted earlier about that faith and trust that they have in water quality monitoring information. and hopefully proving to them that, you know, they can have faith that it is my molecule of nitrogen that we're seeing leaving a farm or a catchment, and giving them some avenues to sort of manage that better into the future. So a bit of a whistle-stop tour of Project 25. Some acknowledgements, obviously the NESP Tropical Water Quality Hub, but I've also had a lot of players in the space in some ways, and I've got all sorts of help and assistance in different shapes and forms from a range of sort of Queensland government agencies, but also the cane industry itself, and the Sorrow Digiscapes team will be a really interesting new tweak on this project in many ways, which I think will give it a lot of direction into the future. So, thank you very much.